What's up, guys? Welcome to the next installment of our mini series. Today we are focusing on the Minnesota Vikings. We are into our first team that actually won in the playoffs last year. They beat the New Orleans Saints in the wild card round 26 to 20 in overtime. I got Kirk Cousins projected out at about 4,200 passing yards, 27 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, 95 rushing yards, and another one touchdown on the ground, giving him about 325 fantasy points. Um, I don't have them sorted, so I don't know where exactly he falls in my rankings. But outside of that, I mean, he's pretty much the mainstay. They did extend him, I believe it was before last season, so he's going to be sticking around for a couple more years there. They really don't have too much behind him as far as backup quarterbacks go. I mean, they got backup quarterbacks obviously, but they don't have anybody that could really step in and do what Kirk Cousins does. So if he goes down, the whole team goes down. But yeah, I mean, he lost one of his top targets in Stephon Diggs this year, but they did draft a replacement in the first round, and I'm going to talk for an hour about him. But overall, this team is they're still pretty solid. They lost a lot on defense. We'll get to that a little bit later on. But what do you think about Kirk Cousins and the quarterbacks here?
Yeah, Kirk Cousins is one of those QBs that I don't normally target very often. He was the 18th ranked QB last year in terms of how many points he scored. Last season, they had the third fewest team pass attempts per game. He averaged the 16th most points per game, which is pretty solid considering the volume that he had. This season, he's going off the board as the 22nd, he has ADP as the 22nd quarterback off the board. And looking at all of his numbers, they're very favorable to him. His offensive line was second in protection rate for pass blocking, which was pretty surprising because Pro Football Focus doesn't have them ranked very highly, but they actually were very effective last year. So we've seen Kirk Cousins have more success in the past, but it's just really it's going to be based on how often they pass the ball. Last season, we saw them implement a very run-heavy scheme with Gary Kubiak calling the plays this year instead of Stefanski. I still expect them to be extremely run-heavy. Not as run heavy as they were last season. Kubiak has preferred the run, but he's been a little more balanced. Kirk Cousins had the least amount of pass attempts in his career last year with under 500. So if they're able to pass the ball and become a little more balanced than they were last year, I do like Kirk Cousins to outperform that 22nd quarterback ADP. He was 18th last year with limited volume. So he's a guy you could see sneak into the top 15. But overall, when I'm taking my quarterback, I prefer a guy that's guaranteed to have volume and a high volume passing offense. And you can't really say that about Kirk Cousins.
No, you cannot. But what you can say that about as far as high volume is Dalvin Cook. He comes in as the running back one. They have Alexander Madison, who is he's a nice change of pace back for him. Good injury insurance there. He's one of the better handcuffs that you could get in the league. Outside of those two, though, they got some other names. I mean, Michael Boone and Amir Abdullah, but it's basically those two. Dalvin Cook, he's a first round pick this year, as he should be. He's been for the past couple of years. But Alexander Madison, he's kind of breathing down his neck. It's not going to be a 90% share for Dalvin Cook. Madison can definitely come in and do some damage there too. What do you think about these running backs?
Yeah, I think Alexander Madison is really underrated, and he's one of those guys for me. Is he just passed the eye test last year when I watched him play? Every time he touched the ball, and it was similar to Tony Pollard in Dallas. I said, who is that guy? He looks really good. So I was impressed with Madison. I think that he can be a starting running back in this league. And one of the things that is really impressive about Madison is he had 530 yards last year between the air and ground games, and he only played 21% of the snaps. I mean, that's really impressive when you start thinking about it. If he was able to gain a starting job and we'll say play 55, 60% of the snaps, whether it's in Minnesota or somewhere else, I mean, that's a guy that could have 1,400 or so yards in a season. So I'd be really intrigued, and I like him in dynasty leagues because Delvin Cook and the future of Dalvin Cook in Minnesota is very much in question. I definitely think I'm not concerned about him holding out this year, but if Madison's able to take over that starting gig, I mean, he could really be an RB1 in my opinion, or at least a RB2 with RB1 upside. So I really like Madison, especially in dynasty leagues. Dalvin Cook, I know everybody's concerned with Dalvin Cook. I see him continue to slide down draft boards. Yeah, but last year he was so good, and people want to, for whatever reason, ignore that. I mean, he was second in points per game. And then I saw that, and I was like, okay, obviously that's impressive. But when I looked at his week to week box scores, I mean, he was so incredibly consistent,
Mhm.
which you don't always see from these top tier guys. Sometimes you see very boom or bust games, but he had 9 games where he was in the top 10. He had 7 where he was in the top 5. So I mean, he was and he only played 14 games on the season. So 50% of the games he played in last year, he was a top 5 running back that week. And that's very impressive when you start to look at it. So I love Dalvin Cook. I have him fourth on my board, right behind the McCaffrey, Barkley, Zeke, and then Dalvin Cook. But he's sliding down because people are scared about the holdout. But I just think there's literally no chance that he holds out. At number one, the team has already said he's reporting. So, and he's going through the weird training camp training sessions they're having this season, and they just signed a new collective bargaining agreement, and they changed some of the rules, not long term, but just to get them through this season. And one of those rules basically heavily penalizes players for holding out. And I'm not exaggerating where I say if Delvin Cook holds out for even one game, he will be writing checks to the team. I mean, he will legitimately owe them money by the end of it because the penalties are out of this world. So I don't think there's any way that he holds out. If the point for him is to get more money, I don't think he's going to want to be writing checks to the team for those penalties. So I draft him with confidence, and if I can grab him in the back end of the first round, I'm pretty pumped about that.
Yeah, just going back to Madison too. I just want to make a little funny here. I think he might have been the most drafted player last year that you really didn't know who it was because of
Yeah.
Dalvin Cook's injury history, and then Dalvin Cook goes and plays 16 games. But yeah, I mean, when he was on the field, though, Madison was definitely he was effective. But Dalvin Cook, as long as he's out there, he's definitely a top 5 running back. What does
hmm
PFF have to say about this offensive line? They got some young studs in there. Garrett Bradbury. They drafted Ezra Cleveland this year. Um, they brought in Riley Reef, so they got some pretty good guys there. But what do they say?
So PFF kind of surprisingly hates the Vikings offensive line. Last season they had him ranked 19th. Heading into this season they have him projected at 23rd. I was a little surprised by that. They do have them much higher ranked as a run blocking unit, which doesn't surprise you knowing that they're a very run heavy scheme here. So they don't like them very much. They have some of their the reason it's drawn down so much is they have their pass blocking grade as one of the bottom 10 in the league. So they're not big fans of this offensive line. But I'm surprised because when you looked at it, and I mentioned it with Kirk Cousins, he had the second highest uh, clean pocket percentage, meaning he really wasn't being touched very frequently last season. So we'll see. I'm surprised by this ranking, but you know, we'll see what happens.
I guess when you got a running back like Dalvin Cook, you really don't need an offensive line. Moving on to their wide receivers, as we mentioned, they lost Stephon Diggs. They traded him away to the Buffalo Bills for a first-round pick and some other things. With that first-round pick, they brought in Justin Jefferson out of LSU, one of Joe Burrow's favorite targets out there. Adam Thielen slots in as the number one now. I mean, I guess you could say he's been the number one, kind of like a 1A, 1B with Stephon Diggs, but now he's the clear-cut number one. Justin Jefferson being the rookie, being this kind of offseason. It's going to take some time to get acclimated with Kirk Cousins. I'm really high on him. I like him more for the future. I like him for dynasty drafts. But I do think that he could have a really successful 2020 season too. I mean, they got a pair of tight ends that we're going to talk about. Dalvin Cook can catch passes out of the backfield. But I mean, he's going to be on the field a lot of the time because they don't have Diggs there anymore. They did bring in Tajay Sharp, who, I mean, last year we saw Devontae Parker kind of break out. We're waiting for a Corey Davis breakout. We're also waiting for Tajay Sharp breakout. So that could be with the Vikings this year with Kirk Cousins. But Justin Jefferson, he seems to be slotted in as the 2. He seems like he's going to be on the field a lot. KJ Osborne is another guy that I like for long term. For after when Adam Thielen's gone, Tajay Sharp is gone, and maybe it's down to Justin Jefferson and KJ Osborne. They could be leading the charge here for the Vikings from the wide receiver position. But other than that, I mean, you might bring up Olabisi Johnson. I don't know if you have any thoughts on him. But outside of those five, which I mean, that's enough right there. What are your thoughts on this wide receiver room here?
Yeah, and the reason that I don't talk about five is because I've kind of brought it up already, but this is a very run-heavy scheme. So at the end of the day, how many of those guys are really going to be fantasy relevant?
Justin
I think
Jefferson.
that's kind of the question. No, he sucks. I think that's one of the questions just around everybody. But I mean, I'll start off with Justin Jefferson. I don't have a problem with Justin Jefferson. I mean, I actually love his talent. I mean, I make fun of you and pick on you, but I really do like Justin Jefferson's talent. I just hate his landing spot. I really do. I just, when you look at the history of the Vikings over the past few years with this run-heavy scheme, they just haven't supported two fantasy relevant wide receivers at the same time. And that's kind of my problem with it. When you look at it, either Adam Thielen's been injured, Stephon Diggs has been injured, and even in those games, they haven't been, top 10 guys. I mean, Thielen went through his crazy stretch there, but then he kind of faded really quickly. And when you look at that stretch, he would have been outside of the top 20, and it was only that stretch he went through where he was a top 5 receiver that really pulled his numbers up. But I just have a lot of question marks with a lot of them. I liked Adam Thielen. I was hoping he would be one of those guys that goes around wide receiver 20 or so with some upside, but I really have seen his draft stock shoot up. He currently has the ADP of the 14th wide receiver off the board, which for me is just too high, and I've seen him
I
go
don't
a few
like it
times
either.
as a top 12 wide receiver. I mean, this is a run-heavy scheme. I get that he's the number one wide receiver, but even in 2018, where he had that crazy stretch where he had 100 yards in a million straight games, it seemed like, he still was only wide receiver 8 on the entire season. So, I mean, and that was a great stretch he went through. He had a very high target share. So I can't see him finishing as a wide receiver 1 against all these other wide receivers that are in high volume passing offenses. So that's my problem with Thielen, is I think that he can be a productive, maybe top 20 wide receiver, but I'm not confident that he's going to be a top 12 guy, and I've seen him go there pretty consistently. I mean, with Justin Jefferson, I already mentioned that it's just a matter. He'll get 80 to 90 targets this year. He will, just because they don't have a ton of high-profile options, and that's what Diggs was on pace for last year. He missed a few games, but he was on pace for about 90 or so targets, and that's where you've seen Diggs settle in right around 90 targets. Being Jefferson's a rookie, I'd say closer to 80 for him in year 1, but if he's getting 80 targets, is he going to be a wide receiver 2 for fantasy purposes? No, not this season. If you ever see the team move on from Adam Thielen and he becomes their absolute number 1, or they change their offensive scheme, that's a whole nother case. But Jefferson, I think, has limited upside based on this offense. Definitely a first-round pick in Dynasty rookie drafts, though. And then you mentioned Tajay Sharp, Olabisi Johnson. Both of those guys are candidates to run some routes out of the slot this season. And I've seen a lot of people put Tajay Sharp in that sleeper category, but it's once again one of these situations, a low-volume passing offense, and who would I rank ahead of Tajay Sharp? Adam Thielen, Justin Jefferson, Delvin Cook. I'd probably put Irv Smith above him, honestly, at this point. I like Irv Smith's talent quite. Kyle Rudolph. So they have quite a few names, and I just can't see one of their third wide receivers having enough value to give you a fantasy production.
All right, and then two other guys that we want to talk about from the tight end position. We got Kyle Rudolph, who has been there for his whole career since 2011. Then they brought in Irv Smith last year via the draft in the second round. Kyle Rudolph actually signed an extension. We thought that Irv Smith was going to take over this tight end position, but it turns out Kyle Rudolph is going to be there for a couple more years, which is not a problem. They could run 2 tight end sets, but that does kind of knock Irv Smith down a little bit. Kyle Rudolph in games last year, even in the playoffs, I think he had the game-winning touchdown against the Saints in the playoffs. In overtime, so he's still one of Kirk Cousins' favorite targets there. Between him and Adam Thielen, those are guys that obviously with this messed up offseason that we have, he's gonna be more comfortable with those guys. Irv Smith, he was on the field a little bit last year, so he'll definitely get some targets, but Irv Smith for dynasty, Kyle Rudolph probably for redraft, but it's kind of tough with two very talented tight ends and how deep the tight ends are this year in fantasy. I don't know if I'd have any of these guys on my team.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off where this is the second highest offense in terms of how often they run two tight end sets. I didn't word that very well, but essentially, I mean, we talk about the Eagles all the time running their two tight end sets. So they run the most amount of two tight end sets in the league. And then the Vikings are second behind them. So, and actually it's very close. They were only about 1.5% behind the Eagles. So I thought that was interesting. So, I mean, these guys, both of them are going to be on the field pretty frequently. That's a whole nother reason why I don't love any third wide receiver in this offense. They primarily run two tight end sets. So you're only playing two wide receivers, which is going to be Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson at that point. So I don't, that's just another reason to not like Tajay Sharp or Olabisi Johnson or any of those other guys. But overall, I like Irv Smith actually quite a bit. I just think he's a very talented tight end. He's going to be on the field quite a bit. And we saw them towards the end of last season start to use him more and more last year. So he was running a lot of routes for him. The first 5 or so games, Irv Smith was only running 5 to 10 routes a game. So, I mean, that doesn't really give you an opportunity for fantasy production. But by the end of the year, he was consistently running for the last 8 games of the season, anywhere between 20 and 35 routes. So they were starting to get him more involved in the pass game. And when you look at a snap percentage, it was increasing pretty rapidly. The last 8 games of the season, he was anywhere from 60 to, he even had one week where he was above 90% on the field. So they really started to use Irv Smith quite a bit at the end of last season. Didn't directly relate to fantasy production, but I think given his talent that it can in the future. So he's going as a 26 tight end off the board right now. I've seen quite a few leagues that are 2 tight ends now, and they have tight end premiums. So if you're in one of those leagues, I definitely think he has value as a second tight end. And if you're in a dynasty league, he's a guy that I might draft as your 3rd tight end with some upside if you have a deep bench. So I like Irv Smith, and he was very talented and was very productive at Alabama, and I always liked watching him in college as well. When it comes to Kyle Rudolph, he actually was very productive last year as well. And people, once again, he's one of those names. He's not very exciting, but I think the reason for that for me is he's very touchdown dependent. He still scored 6 touchdowns last season, but he only had 300 yards. So, I mean, this isn't a guy that's going to get you a ton of fantasy production. When you look at the number of routes that he ran, only 58% of the plays that he was on the field for, he ran a route. So, you know, he was blocking quite a bit, and he's a very talented pass blocker, which I think is one of the reasons that they kept him around. But he still was the 18th best tight end in terms of points per game last year. It's just a matter of, do you want to ride the streak? And for me, not really. I'd rather have a guy that's a little more consistent. I don't want to cross my fingers for that 2 tight end or that 2 touchdown game. So if I'm taking a chance on one of these guys, they're actually going back to back. Irv Smith as the 26th tight end, Kyle Rudolph as the 27th. I'm taking a chance on the younger guy with upside in Irv Smith.
All right, that's somebody really got lazy with the rankings there, putting 2 Vikings tight ends back to back.
Yeah.
Moving on to the special teams, Amir Abdullah is back there returning kicks and punts, but he's also a cut candidate if he doesn't make the team. KJ Osborne, that's a name I brought up in the wide receivers. Obviously, he's probably not going to be one that's in your starting lineup, but if you do have a kick and punt return slot specifically on your team, he's a good way to go. Definitely because he could see the field on offense, get you some points there, and then, but for the most part, do a lot of his damage in the return game. As far as their kicker goes, Dan Bailey, we've heard of that name. He's been kicking balls for a long time now. Out in Dallas, for the most part, he's been in a dome for most of his career. And he stays in a dome. Minnesota has a dome out there, but they do play in the NFC North. Green Bay's outside, Chicago's outside, Detroit's in a dome. So, at least 9 of his games are inside. This offense, I think they can move the ball. Kirk Cousins, he's a nice game manager. He can move the ball really well. Dalvin Cook, you got there, so be able to get in the field goal range, making Dan Bailey fantasy relevant. He's a guy that is probably in the top 12, should definitely be drafted if you're forced to draft a kicker, or if you need a kicker in your league. He's a guy that should be rostered, but Yeah, I mean he's definitely got we've seen him kick before, kick some long field goals. He's got a few 55, 60 yarders under his belt there.
Yeah, and he's definitely one of those kickers. If everybody in your league is drafting a kicker, definitely draftable 100%. Last season, he was ranked as the eighth best kicker in terms of the number of points he scored. Very favorable very favorable weather conditions. The offense was they were top 10 in terms of scoring touchdowns in the red zone, so that can hurt him a little bit. But overall, nice weather conditions, a solid offense. He's a very accurate kicker, even going back to his days in Dallas. So definitely a reliable option in the top 10.
All right, and then finally their defense. It's definitely taken a little bit of a step back, I believe. They lost quite a few in their secondary. They have a few good IDPs between Daniil Hunter, Eric Kendricks, Anthony Barr, Harrison Smith. Their second first round pick this year, they traded back into the first round. They took Jeff Gladney, the cornerback. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, you really don't want to target cornerbacks, but for dynasty leagues, deeper dynasty leagues, he might be a way to go with somebody throw on your taxi squad, see how it goes there. But they overall, as a defense, they're probably middle of the road, I would say. Maybe a streamer a few weeks, Chicago against Detroit, teams like that. But obviously, they have Green Bay twice a year. Detroit can put up some points, so I don't know why I just said them as a streamer against them. I guess if Matt Stafford is out, play Minnesota's defense. But those IDPs that I mentioned, and you'll touch on them too, they got a good mix in there.
I think you're thinking of the David Blau Lions.
Oh
That's
yeah,
why.
those guys.
David Blau Lions, yeah, absolutely. But they were actually pretty effective as a unit last year. They were sixth in the league in terms of fantasy points, so very effective. And they're one of those teams where, even on paper, if their defense isn't as strong as last season, I just don't think you can count them out. Mike Zimmer is one of the best defensive minds in the league, and he always has them ready to play, and he makes some great halftime adjustments as well. So they'll definitely be productive. In terms of, I wouldn't be drafting them as a top 10 unit, by the way, but they have the ability to be productive in the right matchup. You already mentioned Daniel Hunter. Last year, he was the third highest scoring defensive lineman with 14 and a half sacks, and he actually had 14 and a half sacks in back-to-back seasons. So he's another name. Usually, he's going top five in terms of D lineman being drafted, as he should be. He's been very productive in a very productive fantasy scheme for this defense. So he's a top end option. Eric Kendricks, one of their linebackers, had over 100 tackles last year. Doesn't really offer much in any other facet of the game. He did rank 41st in terms of linebacker scoring last season, so he wasn't overly productive, but maybe a guy you can stream in the right matchup. And then the last guy is Harrison Smith. He's a consensus top 10 DB in really every IDP format. Get you tackles, get some interceptions. We'll throw a few sacks in there. He's very versatile, so he's definitely a nice option there as well.
And then one other guy I want to mention. I don't think we could do this show without mentioning this guy's name. They have a defensive tackle with the first name Hercules. What do you think about that?
I mean, I don't see how he wouldn't be in the Hall of Fame immediately.
Hercules. That's I'd want to see him make the team. It's his first name though, so it's not going to be on the back of any
I was like, you
jersey.
want to pronounce his last name?
No, I don't. All right. So our final projections, final thoughts on the Vikings. Like I said, I believe their defense is a big part of them, but I think they do take a step back. And if you listen to our Detroit episode many moons ago, I think that Detroit is actually a sleeper to make a wild card position. But Green Bay is still in that division. So by process of elimination, Minnesota has to drop down to third. Green Bay finishes first in the division. Detroit sneaks up to second, maybe with like a 10-6, 9-7 record. Minnesota, I'll put them at 8-8, 9-7, finishing third, and unfortunately not being able to break New Orleans Saints fans' hearts this year.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on this. I said in our Lions episode, I do think that the Lions can finish in second, but I think them and the Vikings will be close. And I've seen quite a few people kind of fade the Vikings to a point where they'll have a losing record. And I definitely don't think that's going to happen. I've mentioned previously, but I really like Mike Zimmer. I have a lot of faith in him as a head coach. I do think as much as they've lost some names in the secondary, they have added some young guys. Even they lost Trey Waynes, but Trey Waynes actually struggled quite a bit last year. So if these offensive or these defensive guys in the secondary can take a step forward, their unit may be better than a lot of people are thinking. And I've seen quite a few people say their defense is going to struggle, but they really haven't lost a ton of pieces. And if their young guys can take a step up, they may be pretty productive. But I'd have them at 9-7, fighting for second place in that division. And I could see the Lions being 8-8 and the Vikings 9-7, or flip flop. So I like the Vikings overall, and I like their situation.
All right, so that is our Vikings episode, and I don't want to end on a bad note for the Vikings, but we mentioned that they beat the Saints in the playoffs, but they eventually lost to the San Francisco 49ers in the divisional round. So I did forget to mention that, but so until the next episode, we'll see you guys then.